In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan chats with Steve Kaplan, a Neubauer Family Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and Kessenich E.P. Faculty Director of the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Steve co-founded the Polsky Center and the Entrepreneurship Program at Chicago Booth, including the Edward L. Kaplan New Venture Challenge, which is recognized as one of the top accelerator programs in the nation. Kaplan serves on the board of Morningstar and several fund and company advisory boards. He has been a member of the faculty since 1988. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
So, Professor Steve Kaplan, I am so looking forward to this, in part because I think I'm going to learn a lot more about you over the next hour and a half, even though I've known you for a long time and got to know you pretty well, but I would say in narrow context, not broad context. And one thing I'm excited to both share and learn is the broad context of who you are and the incredible contributions you have made and will continue to make in kind of very broad categories, and I think on the global stage is fair to say as well. So let's start with, though, this recent recognition that you got from a donor who wants to recognize you in a way that has a very long-lasting legacy. Can you tell us about that?
No, this was really nice. So first of all, it's great to be here. And like I said, like the only good thing, right? Like I always say, the only good thing about getting older is that your former students get more successful. And Dan is Exhibit A in that. So it's a great pleasure to be, sort of hanging out and seeing my very successful students. So thank you for having me here, and congratulations on all of your success. So what happened this year is one of our successful alums who's also a friend. He wasn't a student, but he's a friend. Robert Mac McCormick, and everybody knows him as Mac, decided to give a chair to the school. But he already gave one with his name on it. And so he decided he wanted to give one with my name on it. And so it's unusual in that they usually don't let you do that while the professor's alive. And, they made an exception. So it's a very cool thing. And Mac is awesome. He was a venture capitalist who was successful at Trident. And he actually was an assistant secretary of the Navy, I believe, and is just a terrific guy.
So he has good judgment, is what you're saying. And we're going to learn
absolutely. And
we're going to learn over the next hour and a half or so why he chose to do that, because we're going to learn how special of a person Steve is. So Professor Kaplan was my professor when I was going to school at night. He was just starting, I think, your career at University of Chicago as well. And he was by far the most memorable and impactful professor I had, both undergrad and graduate. It almost opened up kind of my mind to a whole different way of combining my skills in the analytical world, in the technical world, but with the ability to do business kind of problem solving. And for whatever reason, it resonated in a big way to me, and really, I think, helped propel my career in the right direction. So at that point in time, University of Chicago was known as a school for finance, very analytical, quantitative school for finance. Today, it's still known for that, but it's also known to be a school for entrepreneurship. Now, you're a premier finance person there, and you play somewhat of a role on the entrepreneurship side. So what role have you played over this long journey on the entrepreneurship side? And tell us, and I want to focus quite a bit on this part of the journey. Why did you not just focus on finance? You're obviously prominent there. What drove you to also focus on entrepreneurship? And how did you and some of your closest colleagues navigate to the point where the school is just as well known on the business side for entrepreneurship as it is for finance today?
So, how much, I guess we have a lot of time, so I'll tell you. So I did way back when, so in the 80s, when leverage buyouts were brand new, I did research on leverage buyouts, and it's now called private equity. And so I was kind of like, at a young age, like one of the world's experts on that. And I actually testified to the Senate Finance Committee in 1989 about leverage buyouts when they had hearings. It was quite a lot of fun. Lloyd Benson rather is peppering me with questions, and it's like, okay, I'll try to answer them. In any event, so I did, came in as a professor, having done research on buyouts, and my research was about corporate governance, buyouts, and kind of the thing I always focused on was how do you create economic value. That's the sort of thing that ties together all of my research. So within it's finance, corporate finance, it's value creation. I know it's something you think about a lot or have thought about a lot in your businesses, and that's where I came from. And so I came and I was a finance professor. I was doing research in those areas. I was teaching corporate finance. I taught the course that you took. And then what happened was I got tenure in, I think it was 1995. And at that point, we had an entrepreneurial finance class. And the person teaching that, left. He's a very good friend of mine. He's a professor at Harvard Business School now. But he left, and the dean came to me and said, you just got tenure. I need someone to teach entrepreneurial finance and private equity. I can find someone else to teach corporate finance. And so I've just gotten tenure. So, and I was teaching the same thing for 7 or 8 years. So I said, well, that might be interesting. And then the course was really, half the course or a third is about private equity, which I'd done research on. So it was actually closer to my research, or as close to my research as the corporate finance. And I knew nothing about venture capital, like zero. So I said yes. And I said, gee, I guess I have to learn this. And then what I did is there are a couple local venture capital firms who were friendly, who let me sit in.
Which firms were those?
It was First Analysis, which turned into MK Capital, was one of them, and then the other one was Trident, which is where Mac McCormick was from, and First Analysis, MK in particular, let me come to their pitch days. So they would have a pitch day every month where their serious companies would pitch, and they just let me sit in the at the table and listen. And so I learned, what VCs do by, partially by watching them. And that's how I got into it. And then once I started teaching the venture capital and private equity, it's really, it's super interesting. It's super fun. The startups are really interesting for obvious reasons. You're sort of seeing the future, and we'll talk more about that. And then the private equity also turns out they're very, very good at creating economic value. And, they're a little controversial still. They were controversial then, but I think, net, they do create economic value. They're very clever about it on average. And so that's also...
I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, then we'll come back. How do you know they really create economic value? How do you know private equity firms really create economic value? Have you just heard that?
So this is where, I did research, and I sort of did the pioneering research in the 80s on operating performance, where, what you do is you take, look at the firms that did buyouts, look at their operating performance, things like margins, cash flows, value creation, compare it to similar companies in the same industry and see how they do. And basically, I found in the 80s, they outperformed. So companies that did the leverage buyouts had, better operating performance after the buyout. And then a lot of people have done research on that since. And I would say almost every large sample paper that looks at this finds the same result, that you compare the buyout firms to firms in the same industry, how they do, and virtually every study, US, UK, France, finds an improvement in performance. And then people have also looked at sort of, do they do it by, having more products. They do it by firing employees. What do they do? And the results are there's some reduction in employment relative to other people in the industry, but it's not large. So it's sort of consistent with them making it more efficient, but they're not firing everybody. They're actually growing. They're just growing a little bit more slowly on the people side. And then, there's one paper that finds for restaurants, they have fewer safety violations, that they're other businesses, there are more new products. And so the overall results on the operating side are pretty positive. They're not uniform. There are a couple of results that are a little negative on the operating side. I think there's one paper that finds for-profit education in buyouts. The companies made money, but obviously they gave too many loans to some people who then defaulted. So, there's some negative to go with the positive, but overall, on the non sort of financial side, positive. And then on the financial side, it's all positive. And that's at the company level. Then you can look at the fund level. And at the fund level, that's another place where the record over time, if you look at the performance of the funds relative to the performance of the S&P 500, and this is net of all fees, the industry has outperformed over the last 30 years.
Yeah, and the studies that you've been part of on that, I know I've had my teams pay attention to. So what Steve is talking about is you look at the performance of the private equity industry with a very solid kind of amount of data, very deep and broad data. So you compare the performance of investors who invest in private equity to the investors who invest in the public markets, and you see if there's better performance, worse performance, and consistently there's always been I don't want to put words in your mouth, Steve, but I've read your studies. The private equity performance has been consistently better than the public market performance.
No, it's and shockingly so, because you would think in a competitive market, those excess returns ought to be competed away. And so net of fees, there shouldn't be outperformance, but over a long, long period, they've outperformed. We'll see if they've hit the end of that period. I think the deals that they did in 2020 and 2021 may not turn out so well. We'll see. But if you look at pretty much any year from 1990 to 2019, the funds outperformed and shouldn't have happened.
Yep. Okay, so we got off track a little bit because you made the comment. Private equity does really well. So let's go back. So you've taken over this class. You're getting a better understanding of venture capital. You're sitting in VC meetings. And one thing I think is, we should add is, people think of venture capital, they think of private equity. And in some ways, it's really a continuum. Like, where do you say it's no longer venture and now it's private equity? And the answer is it depends. But somewhere in that Series A, Series B is where you might stop thinking of it as venture capital and start thinking of it as more of a private equity play. Is that fair to say?
I think you go, the continuum is like startups for sure. That's venture capital. And then as they grow, you still take venture capital. And then at some point, really when they're cash flow positive or, close, so they're making money, but they're still growing, then they still need money. And I would call that growth equity, which is private equity, but not buyout. And then, as you use growth equity for a while. And then, on the other extreme, when you're a more mature company, and then if the company, maybe it's public and there's room to improve it if you take it private, or it's still private and the founder wants to exit or sell a chunk of what he or she has done, then you get the buyouts, and that's the leverage buyout, which is also called private equity today.
Yep. And so one thing that was probably easy from a University of Chicago lens was, I'm teaching venture capital, and a lot of the University of Chicago people by nature go and become investors. They become venture capitalists. They become private equity investors. What was less natural compared to perhaps some other universities is entrepreneurs coming out of that environment. So that's not true today, but back then it was certainly true. Walk us through that transition.
So I started teaching the venture capital and private equity course in '96. And I remember that because the first time I taught it was the quarter, my first son was born. So I was teaching while he was, when he came along. And one of the students, came to me and said, look, there are these other schools that have venture, new venture competitions or business plan competitions. Could we have one at Booth? And, I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. I don't want to do any work. You guys do all the work, and I'll find you some judges. I'll find you some prize money. So I found them some judges and some prize money. The students did it, and it was actually, kind of fun and kind of cool, the companies that came out of it. And so I said, what would make this better? And they said, you should do it as a course and do it for credit. So I said, okay. The next year I decided, so I did my private equity and venture capital class, but I also did a class around the business plan competition, which we call the New Venture Challenge. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But so I'm doing that, I'm doing the venture capital and private equity course. I started doing the New Venture Challenge. And then the dean comes to me, Bob Hamada at the time, and he said, University of Chicago, we have to have an entrepreneurship program because the world is going to become more entrepreneurial. And if we don't have an entrepreneurship program, we're going to die. And so you have to give him a lot of credit. So this was a guy who was a finance professor all his life. He's the dean. And he sort of says, we have to do that. And he says, you're the only tenured professor who's remotely close to entrepreneurship. You're in charge. And I said, thanks a lot. So, I said I'd do it. And that's how I got started. It was sort of serendipitous, right? I started teaching this course, and then the dean twisted my arm. And so at the time, we had 3 entrepreneurship courses. That was it. We had like new venture strategy, building the new venture, and the entrepreneurial finance. And
one pause here, because this is around 1997, 1998.
This is 96, 97. Yeah.
So if you think about where the world was in those same years, at this point, the internet had made its way into the business world, but it was still new as part of the business world. There was a lot of craziness going on, but we didn't quite hit the big boom cycle. We didn't hit the dot-com boom. We didn't hit the telecom boom. We were certainly accelerating toward the height of that boom, but we were early in that process. You were starting to see events happen, but the notion of, boy, you got these dot-com unicorns and you got these crazy fiber companies, that was starting to rear its head. But just started.
Yeah, it was 2 or 3 years. It was coming, but it wasn't there. So that's to Bob's credit that he saw this and he said go do it. And in fact, as you know, this is an aside, but as part of my course, right? Because I didn't know anything, and all the cases, you have to understand at that time, all the cases were Harvard Business School cases, and that's still true around business schools. In general, they use a lot of Harvard Business School cases. I wanted to have some of my own. So just by chance, I wrote a case on a company called Focal Communications, which was right in your wheelhouse. And I wrote that case right after they raised money. And I think they raised their money in the fall of '96. So I think I wrote the case in early '97. And that turned out to follow an arc that you were a part of.
So the co-founder and CEO of Focal was 1 year ahead of me. We both were part of the management development program that started at Illinois Bell and then ended at Ameritech. I went to MFS, and then a couple years later, he joined us at MFS. So he was an MFS veteran as well. And then when we went off and got level 3 going, he went off with one of our other MFS colleagues, if I remember right, and started Focal Communications. So Bob Teo and I have a history together. More than just being in the same industry, we actually worked side by side at times.
Right. He was a Booth alum. So he
True.
exactly. Yeah. So no, it's pretty cool how all of these things intersect. So anyway, so I started doing this, and then, I said, Bob, I can't do this alone. I need to hire an executive director who can really run things. And so we hired a woman named Ellen Rudnick, who had been an executive at Baxter, and then she did a startup that she took public in life sciences. And she, had sold out of that, and she was looking for something else to do. So we hired her as the executive director, and she was awesome. So I was kind of like the chairman, and she was the CEO of what we did. And she would come up with ideas. We should have this course. We should do this. I would say yes. She would go do them. And over time, we built up the entrepreneurship program. And we also kept building the New Venture Challenge. So the New Venture Challenge, actually, I should ask you, what do you want me to talk about?
Yeah, let's do this. Let's jump, ahead to today and describe what is both the New Venture Challenge, but also the whole Innovation Entrepreneurship program. So what exists today? And then we'll go back and say, how'd you go from, hey, we brought in Ellen and we started to focus on this. How did you get there? Because it's important. It's important for you to understand that the there is a big deal. Like what exists today is a big deal when it comes to this topic on a global stage.
So today, I should know how many courses we have, but we have a ton of courses. It must be 20 or 30 that count for entrepreneurship. We're the most popular concentration. So concentration is like a major. And when I started in 96, we had these 3 courses. It was not a concentration or a major. And today it's a concentration, and it's the most popular at the school by a decent margin. Finance is number 2. So I'm well hedged. I've got a foot in both. And we have some, private equity related courses. We've got the various courses related to startups, and also how you would do, digital marketing pieces of what you would do in a startup. We've got, what may be the best entrepreneurship through acquisition program in the country, where you come in as a student and you may not have an idea, but you go and look for a company to buy. And when you buy it, you're basically running it. So you're an entrepreneur in a real sense. So we have a really, broad set of offerings today from kind of nothing. And we run a ton of students through it. And, the programming, I would put up against, the programming at any school in the country. And we end up now, again, from nothing. When Business Week does its ratings of schools, and they'll rate entrepreneurship programs, we've been in the top 5 the last several years. And so there's a recognition that we're doing something right.
Who else is in the top 5 typically?
I want to say Berkeley, Stanford, Babson, and somebody else. I'm not sure. It might be MIT. But it's good. It's good company. Good company.
Okay, and then talk about the programs around the education curriculum that have developed and exist, in their current form. And we'll come back to how we got there. But
so the one that's I think has been the most fun, and I think is hugely impactful to our students, is the New Venture Challenge. And so, Dan's very involved with it, so he knows it really well. But this is basically our business plan competition. It's run through a course, and the process is just incredible. It's a process we discovered really in '98 when I did that course for the first time. And so what we do, and we did then and we've done ever since, is you start off by asking students to apply to the course, and they have to have a preliminary business plan. And this year we got like 80 or 90 of these preliminary plans. And you look at the plans, and then what we do is we say, okay, which of these plans are promising and which aren't? And the ones that aren't promising, we don't take. The ones that are promising, we let in. And usually that's about 30 teams a year. Back in '98, it would have been 8 or 10. Now it's like 30 a year. And we then, once we let them in, then they can take the course. Then our goal is to just help them as much as we can. So we will meet with them. I've got people, when we started doing it, it was just Ellen and me. Now it's, Ellen's still involved, I'm involved. We've got like 5 or 6 other coaches who meet with all the teams. And when we meet with the teams, we try to introduce them to people who can help them. So we'll say, what do you need? And a lot of them will say, well, I want to talk to a potential customer. And we'll say, okay, I know somebody who's at a potential customer, and or I need a supplier, or whatever they need. We try to introduce them to people who can help them. And then they take the course, and the course, we do some lecturing, but for the most part, the course is the teams have to present their plans, and we'll have, and it's sort of like Shark Tank, we'll have, but it's like, instead of 4 people, we'll have like 14. And, it's a lot tougher. And they get, they get a little bit longer than what you see in Shark Tank. And basically they are when they present, they are really getting very brutal but constructive feedback. And they do that in April. And a lot of the teams get, I don't want to say beaten down, but they get a lot of feedback. And what's amazing is they take that feedback and they respond to it, and they present again in May, and they've adjusted to the feedback, and they're much better. They get, constructive feedback again. And then we take the 10 or 12 best companies and put them in the finals, and they're better again. And so what you see over this 3-month process, or it's actually more of a 4-5-month process, is like just amazing. They will start off as ideas, and then some of them will crash and burn, which they should. They'll learn that they're not going anywhere. And that's a great thing. It's a learning experience. We're in the business of education. But the ones that have something, some of these really just, emerge as real businesses. And, we've helped them a huge amount. And so that's, I can, talk about failures and successes, because successes, we had GrubHub when it was just starting. We helped them quite a bit. We had Braintree, which bought Venmo and then was bought by PayPal. We helped them quite a bit. We had a company called Simple Mills, which some of you will know, which is low glycemic index, gluten-free baked goods. Simple Mills is now in probably almost every supermarket in the country. If you go to the baked goods section, you'll see that. And we've got a number of others that have been very successful. And this year, in our competition, was unusual, or is unusually good. We gave out to the winning teams, they got about $2 million of investment in the finals, which I think is the most of any business plan competition, any business school business plan competition in the country. And then 2 of those teams, after the competition, raised another $1 million each. So we can sort of say they got from that competition, they raised $4 million this year, which is a record. And that's on the success side. On the failure side,
let me just pause there, just put some exclamation points behind what you just said. So when Steve said the day of the finals, they received $2 million. And then we'll talk about the other $2 million in a second. They received $2 million of what?
Of investment. So between the school has a pot of money to invest in the companies, or the Polsky Center, actually, the Entrepreneurship Center. And so I should explain that the Entrepreneurship Center at Chicago Booth and the university is called the Polsky Center. Michael Polsky is maybe the most successful wind and solar entrepreneur in the country. It's Booth alum. He funded it. He's awesome. And so the Polsky Center has some money. We invest in the companies. And then the judges, including Dan, can invest in the companies. And so between the Polsky Center and our judges, the companies raised $2 million this year. And then one of the judges has a venture fund, and he put in another $2 million into two of the companies. So that's where the $4 million come from. But that's investment. It's not prize money. It's not, it's real investment.
Yeah, real investment by investors.
By real people, yes.
Who are expecting a return. Not doing it because they're trying to get back to the university. Certainly we're trying to support the university and inspire kind of the future entrepreneurs to come forward and develop these businesses. But when you're going to write the checks, you're like, okay, which of these business plans, which of these entrepreneurs are likely to deliver very good returns? Now,
but this is not meant to be charity. No, that is correct. This is meant
had to have been, let's say they were all horrible businesses. It was just a horrible year. And what's the minimum amount that would have been awarded on that last day?
I mean, I think, we had, last year was not as good a year. It was 1.4 million. This year was.
No one who had discretion. No one,
Oh, I think what do we have? I think it'd be 400,000.
400, maybe 500. So everything beyond that.
It is real, very real.
To 2 million on that very day, and then 2 million to 4 million shortly thereafter. That was solely driven by investors either in the room. Well, they're all in the room.
They were all in the room.
I think all the follow-on was from people in the room as well, deciding that the promising teams were worthy of receiving investments in the form of safe notes. So these aren't kind of pretend businesses and a pretend business plan competition, or you're awarding them because you're trying to be politically appropriate relative to
or we have to give the money out. That is correct. Correct.
And I point that out and I emphasize that because that's part of what makes this so rewarding and so effective, is that we've seen this go from very small amount of potential award to an increasingly big number. This year set a new high water mark, and hopefully we set future high water marks each year going forward. But it's because that this has turned into the real pursuit of businesses that deserve to be funded. And that's awesome. So I think the effect of that is so much broader than just the teams that get funded.
Right. If any of you out there are thinking of going to business school, you should know it's a real thing, and it's a great business school. And if you have a good idea, we really help.
So I assume this is just undergrads who are part of these teams?
No, this is MBAs. So this is
MBAs.
This is just MBAs like you were. And I'll go, but let me just do the aside on the failure. We even have, we have failures. You learn stuff. And it turns out that Apple named their new CFO this week, Kevin Parekh. He was in the 1998 New Venture Challenge.
Really?
His team, I think, came in third place, and I think one of the people who did it and then sold it. So, even the people who don't actually go on and do the businesses, presumably learn something. He also took the entrepreneurial finance and private equity course from me, I think the next year. So people learn whether they succeed or not. So it's a great experience.
And I assume the judges are so smart that it's always the first and second place team that go on to be successful, not the fourth, fifth, or 10th place team. Is that true?
That is not true. So this is something that people who have been part of venture capital understand. It's really hard at an early stage to pick out who's going to succeed, and so some of the cases, GrubHub was first, Braintree was first, Simple Mills was first. So our big winners, many of our big winners were first, but we've had some big winners that were not first. So there's a company called Ben and Frank, which is effectively the Warby Parker of Mexico and I think Latin America. They came in seventh, and the year that they were in the competition, they were probably the most successful company. They came in seventh. We had one company that I don't think they made the finals. Open Water, which is the aluminum cans for water that is doing very well, and many of you will have seen at various events or stores. And they didn't even make the finals. So the judges are not infallible at all, but they're pretty good. I mean, I would say pretty good, but not infallible.
Well, all of our money this year as Cruise Ventures, all of ours went into the team that ended up in first place, and we participated in the follow-on after the competition too. So we ended up putting a bit more money in there on top of what we awarded that day. So, but we've invested in companies as part of the competition who came in third or came in fourth. And
yeah, 2 years ago, not last year, but 2 years ago, I think the best team was the third or fourth place team, and that's the one you put the most money into. So,
good. Okay, so before we go backwards in time, you mentioned the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship. What is that? Is that just a concept that floats out there, or is it something more than that?
So it started out as we were I think we're the Entrepreneurship Center at Booth, and that just meant that we had some money that the dean gave us some money. Actually, the Kauffman Foundation gave us $1 million as sort of seed money back in 1998, which was very impactful. And so we were a center, which is just basically a place where you have some people and have some money. Then when Michael Polsky came along and gave us a meaningful gift, it became the Polsky Center. It was at Booth, and that again, it's where Ellen sat. Then we had some space in the building that we moved into. That was the Polsky Center, a space for some faculty, some staff, and for students to come and get advice. So that's what the physical Polsky Center is, and it's a physical space as well as a vehicle to fund the things that we do. And this is something people are shocked at, like, how did you do that in an academic institution? Isn't that impossible to do? And it was one of these things where we were very scrappy, and we would just do stuff. And particularly Ellen would say, let's do this. I'd say, okay, great. And then we figure out how to get the money to do it. And we would just continually just do things that made sense. We would, we were efficient with the money we had. And we, just slowly kept building. And then, I forget when it was. When did Bob come to us? Must have been like 2012 or 13, maybe somewhere like 15 17 years later. The president of the university, Bob Zimmer, noticed we're doing an awesome job, and he said, why don't you do this for the whole university? And so then what our goal or remit is now we're the Entrepreneurship Center for the university. And so a lot of it
at the time, though, when you were asked to consider making that change, that wasn't an easy decision to make, right? There was a lot of history, a lot of emotion, a lot of uncertainty about what will happen next. How did you guys process that?
So that organizationally, it's harder because when we were at Booth, you more or less it's I want to say straightforward. Its focus was focused on the MBA students, and you had some control over what went on at booth. The dean, controlled, basically the dean controls a lot there. Once you go to the university, then you've got tech transfer, which is, was a different organization, and you have various departments. You have the med school and biological sciences, you have physical sciences, you have computer science. And so it becomes much more complicated. And it's also, the tech transfer piece is a very, it's very different from what we do at Booth. Booth, the students come with the ideas, and the university doesn't have intellectual property rights. At the rest of the university, that's not true. So we had to figure that out. There was some trepidation. There were two, I think, issues to worry about. One is diluting yourself. So if we do the university and we mess up what we're doing at Booth, that would be very bad. And then two, just navigating the rest of the university. And I think what we've done and have been successful at, and I think over time we'll get more successful at, is we've kind of retained Booth. And Booth is more or less, I focus on Booth and run that with a Booth executive director, Erica Mercer. And then the executive director of Polsky, who today is Samir Mayakar, who's a rock star. Yes. He focuses more on the rest of the university. And then the other thing that's important is tech transfer is part of our organization. So what's important is tech transfer, if it's separate, you can get into, there's some opportunity for conflict. And tech transfer as part of the organization, that conflict is much less. And you really, tech transfer, really what you want them to do is help the faculty get their ideas either licensed or into companies. And to have it as part of the Entrepreneurship Center makes a ton of sense. So our job now, I think we're structured right. We have the right organizational structure. I think we have the right people. And now our job is to just do a better job of getting the science out, and at the same time, getting our MBA students involved with some of the science. And then the last piece is we actually have great college students now. This college has always been good, but it's like spectacular now. And so we have a college New Venture challenge, and that's also a pocket of people to potentially help out.
Yeah. So talk about the diversity of the business plans and the quality of the business plans, how that's been impacted by the Polsky Center moving from the business school to the full university, inclusive of tech transfer. Do you see a different mix of business plans that make it to the finals? Do you see, is that part of what's driven the increased quality of the finalists?
I'm trying to think. I think it's the last several years we've had some very good life science teams, not last year, but in the previous years. And we've had some hard tech teams. Trying to think, the space team that you invested in actually did not come out of the university, right? That came out of the MBA student. So I would say we've done a better job. The first 10 years, we saw very little out of the university, first 10 or 15 years. Now we get more teams every year that have some real technology from parts of the university, and we marry that with generally a student or two, an MBA student or two, and bring that into the competition. And that tends to be more of the hard, if you have sort of deep tech kind of teams, that those would come from there, as opposed to the more applied teams like a GrubHub or Simple Mills. That's more likely to come from the MBA students.
Yeah, and in the absence of this moving to university, it's been very difficult for a deep tech team to be part of this. I mean, their interest level would have been, probably not there because they would barely know what's even going on, or if they did, they'd be so far removed. But you are starting to see, or I've observed, you are starting to see in the finals a handful of teams that have that deep tech contribution that you just wouldn't otherwise see, including the life sciences teams. So,
no, that is correct. We have 3 or 4 accelerators that are separate from the New Venture Challenge that also try to launch some of these, companies from the sciences and the rest of the university. And then, so some of those teams have gone through a program that it's a Polsky program, but it's outside the business schools. Some business school students are involved. And then some of those teams that have done well have then popped into the New Venture Challenge.
great. So we'll move on to a different topic in a little bit, but give us that journey now. So you told us where you are now, which is a big deal. You told us where you began. You hinted a little bit on how you got from here to there, but how did you navigate that? Because how many business schools, how many universities would love to have what you guys have, what we have at University of Chicago? But you guys have done it. You've done it, and you continue to do it, and it's evolving in a positive direction from where it is right now. How'd you get there?
So first of all, you hire good people, right? So Ellen Rudnick was amazing. I work with Mark Tebby on the New Venture Challenge now. He's amazing. Samir is amazing. So first of all, you hired really good people. Second of all, we just took action. So I think this is true in business. I think it's true in academics. You have to make decisions and do things. And so we would say, okay, what should we do? And then we did them. And I think we were careful about, not overspending and sort of keeping within our resources. And if we needed more resources, then to do something we wanted to do, get the resources, then go do it. So I think it's have the right people, make sure you have the resources, and then third, it's do it. And I think on the margin, and this is something that I think this is true in general. It's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And I think that's maybe I shouldn't say that publicly, but that is in fact how we operated.
So I think there's one other element that I'd like you to speak toward as well. And maybe this wasn't there in the beginning, maybe it developed during it, but the zest to want to see real businesses get launched, businesses that and entrepreneurs that are really going to create a Simple Mills, really going to create a Braintree, that was kind of a principle. Like, we're not just doing this for student experience so that they could kind of get some exposure to what it's like to put together a business plan, what it's like to present. The whole guiding principle is we want kind of success stories.
This was always real. And I think that was always that. I would say the first year I didn't get that. I was like, let's just do the competition. The second year I did it, and we did this. It was the first time we used this process that I mentioned. And I was just blown away by what happened, in that these kids who had ideas, 3 months later, they were potential companies. And it was like, whoa, this can really work. And it turns out, that process, which remember was 1998, that's essentially the process Y Combinator and Techstars use. And they weren't started for another 10 years. So if I'd been less of a professor and more of an entrepreneur, I would have started, Techstars or Y Combinator, because we had that model. And it's still the case. Some pieces of our model, I think, are superior to what Y Combinator and Techstars do, but they've been obviously massively successful. But it's just we kind of stumbled on it and realized we can create real companies, and we get better at it every year, and we just we keep doing it.
It's funny because you said you use the word resources. We had the resources, but really, I think it's, at least from my perspective, the resources follow what you just said. It's not you had resources and therefore you were able to structure this in a way that produced real viable companies. It's that you're producing really viable companies and really interesting entrepreneurs, which meant more resources would become available. And I'm a case study of that. Why have I been writing checks in that for, at least 10 years now? It's because it's been rewarded. It's been rewarding in the form of seeing, real entrepreneurs doing real things, developing real businesses, and feeling gratitude to be part of that. So I think that's probably whatever it was that enabled you guys to have that mentality, that commitment, because that's not necessarily common in the university world. That a lot of them struggle because they we could probably talk for an hour or two on why it is, but a lot of them have, I think, these blocks where they let other stuff get in the way of that. That may sound good, but if you don't start with that commitment that we really want to focus this on what's going to produce the best outcome in the form of real entrepreneurs doing real things, everything else falls in place. I mean, all students benefit from that, even the ones who are trying to do that but come up short. The bar's been raised and everyone benefits. And so I think the impact on the broader community of students, the broader community of faculty, I think it just feeds off of the real success stories.
No, and the other thing that I should mention is so you got some of the people, teams just fail, some succeed and go on. And the ones that fail or don't get there, I mentioned, Kevin Perek, who's at, the Apple CFO. I also have a bunch of venture capitalists. So I would say a good chunk of the Boost students who become serious VCs went through the New Venture Challenge, like Jay Doss, who is one of the people who runs Sapphire Ventures, which is a prominent later stage venture fund, was in that first New Venture Challenge in '98 as well. And I've got, over the years, I've got a number of others who were in the New Venture Challenge, and they, might have done a startup, might not have, but then they found their way into venture capital.
Okay, let's do a little shift in topics. So the other thing you do is you publish studies, you publish papers. You've done a number of them over the years. Roughly how many have you been part of? But what are your 2 or 3 that you feel you have the most, I don't know if pride's the word, right, but you think are the most impactful, the most meaningful? What ones would you point to that are the biggest deals in your mind?
So I would say I've been a professor now 36 years. And, if you get, it's like 2 published papers a year is a very good pace if you can do that, if they're quality pieces. So I think I've written, and maybe some years you don't hit that, but I must have 50 or 60 papers. I am not sure. And then what you look at, everybody in academia pays attention to Google Scholar, which measures how much your work is cited. And that's where, I have a very healthy citation count. I have like more than 50,000 citations on my papers. And when you look at a paper, at least in finance and economics, a paper that gets more than 1,000 citations is kind of like a home run. So, and I've got like, 18 to 20, more than 1,000 citation papers. So those are like the big winners. So which are the ones I'm most proud of? They're all, I love all my children. So, but I'll tell you,
I think have been most impactful.
Now I'll talk about. I can think of 2 right away that are awesome. So one is a paper I wrote with Antoinette Shore, who is a PhD student of mine and is now the editor of the Journal of Finance and is a very senior professor at MIT. And we wrote the first paper that tried to measure the performance of venture capital funds and private equity funds. And so we wrote this 20 years ago, and it was really hard to get the data. And we managed to figure out how to get, what was then we thought the best data available. And we wrote a paper about measuring private equity and venture capital performance. And the thing we came up with, which was sort of, we thought pretty straightforward, was something called the public market equivalent. And what that is, it basically says, take a venture capital fund. How do you measure the performance? Because it's coming, money's going in, money's coming out. And how do you compare it to an alternative, which would be just investing it in the S&P 500? And so we came up with a measure called the public market equivalent. And because there was some other public market equivalent out there, it's called the Kaplan Shore public market equivalent.
Oh,
and
really?
This is now, so it's got my name on it, and Antoinette's too. It's called the KSPME, if you want to know what it's.
Kaplan had to get the first name. Why was it?
Right, KS, Kaplan Shore, so it's KS. And this thing is now used across the industry. So if you ask, if you go to the data providers, Burgess is a big one, which is now MSCI, PitchBook, they will, when they do their benchmarking, they will report the KSPME of private equity funds and venture funds. So that's very cool. They have an index. It'll be there forever, and it'll have my name on it forever.
Can you tell us how the index works? Is there a way to...
No, it's going to bore your audience. It's very simple. It just basically says, okay, take $1. The dollar goes into the venture fund. Let's say it goes in what's today, August, 2024. And then at the same time, okay, I'm putting $1 into the S&P 500. And then let's say 3 years later, I sell the venture investment, and the dollar turns into $2. What you want to do is say, what happened to the S&P 500 over that period? If I put the money in the S&P 500 and that turned into $2, well, then $2 divided by $2 is 1. It's it's even. If the S&P is still at 1, then my PME is 2. That's really good. I made twice as much money in venture as I did in the S&P. Now, if the S&P goes to 4 and the venture just did 2, well, then it's 2 over 4 is 0.5. That's not very good. So that's basically what it does. So it's very simple. And you just do it across the portfolio, add it up, and there you go.
Gotcha. Awesome. And so you come up with that metric, but you're also assessing the performance as best you could back then of venture investments. What did you learn when you first did that?
So this is I don't know, it's not embarrassing. It's kind of funny. Is what we found in that paper was that venture outperformed the S&P 500 and buyout didn't. And we also found that the funds that outperformed, if the first fund outperformed, then the second fund was likely to. So we found persistence. So those are basically the 3 things from the paper. Number 1 was this index, which will last forever, I hope. The second thing was we found persistence, particularly on the venture side. And the third thing was the performance. Now, it turned out the data were bad. So it was a bad data set in that the data were stale for some of the funds. So that performance measurement turned out not to be right. And I wrote a paper 10 years later with Bob Harris and Tim Jenkinson, where we got the data from Burgess, which is now MSCI, which was really good. And that's where we found the buyouts, had this outperformance over a long time where we used the right data. And the venture was more variable. Some years really good, some years not. And the persistence actually still held. There was a lot of persistence in venture. There was a little persistence in buyout. So that's the but it's funny that the data were sketchy in that first paper, even though we thought it was the best data set. It turned out now that company is now out of business because people figured out the data weren't any good.
Gotcha. So that's one thing. Give us another example of one of the
So,
papers that really
so
good.
the other paper, and there are a couple, but let's talk about one. There's a paper that I wrote with Per Stromberg, who is now at the Stockholm School of Economics, where we looked at venture capital contracts. So there's a lot of economic theory about contracting. Here's how it should work. And there were different theories. And nobody had really tested the theory by looking at contracts. And what's great about venture capital contracts is they were very close to what the theorists were thinking about. Because the theorists, were thinking about, okay, you have an idea, you don't have enough money to fund it. How do you fund it? What do the contracts look like? And so Per and I were able to get a set of, it was like 200 contracts from the venture capitalists we knew, including, Mac. Mac was one of the people who gave us contracts that he'd used. And we got them from, the MK Capital and from a bunch of other places. And we looked at the contracts and then said, okay, here's what the contracts look like. These theories make sense. These theories don't make sense. That paper, it's my second or third most cited paper. And what's very cool about that is, I want to say, I forget the exact year, but it's like, around 2014 or so, they gave 2 Nobel Prizes in economics to theorists, Bengt Holmstrom and Oliver Hart. And in Oliver Hart's, and those 2 people, our paper had looked at their theories. And in Oliver's Nobel Prize speech, he cited that paper as like the best paper that tested his theory. And so that was pretty cool to be in a Nobel Prize. And Oliver, is a friend, and Oliver and Bengt are both friends. So it's like that was just very cool.
Great. And so, maybe give us a little bit more insight into what that really means. Like what?
So here's how the contracts work. So venture capital contracts, which a lot of people don't. Entrepreneurs sometimes don't love those contracts because they think they're tough. The way those contracts work, and I actually use this in the teaching, is they're set up in a way that basically makes a huge amount of economic sense. So a venture capital contract, when you get money from a venture capitalist, first of all, what happens is the venture capitalists, get some equity. So they care if the business does well, and you have equity as a founder. So if the business does well, everybody's happy, and everybody makes a lot of money. What's interesting is if the business doesn't do so well. And as the business doesn't do so well, what the contracts do is they basically give the venture capitalists more power. They have board rights, they have liquidation rights, they have other control rights. And as performance gets less good, those rights become more powerful. And that's what we saw in the contracts when we looked at them. And it's very consistent with a couple of the theories that people had written. So that's why Oliver was happy. It was consistent with one of his theories. And it also turns out it's like, it makes a ton of sense. Things are going well, the entrepreneur has control. Things aren't going so well, then the VC gets more control. That's like an efficient outcome, even if this is very painful if you're the entrepreneur, if things don't go so well.
I think safe notes are going through a big evolution right now in reaction to the current times, and because the safe notes really didn't have that safeguard if things are going poorly. It's almost like everyone got sloppy and said, "Oh, things are always going well. This is just getting started. Don't pay much attention." It's different if it's a business plan competition, but safe notes that were done more when you didn't have.
Yeah, you've got. Well, it's not just safe notes. Look at FTX. right? I mean, it's sort of the exception proves the rule. They didn't put in governance, and
Yeah.
it went wrong in the typical deal. I mean, the typical deal, your typical Series A, you're getting these control rights, right? You get a board seat, liquidation preference, control rights, and that, like, you should have them. I mean, the entrepreneur doesn't like it, but it's like, it's the efficient outcome, because if they're not performing, you want to be able to fix it.
Yeah, and I'm experiencing one situation right now that's right up the middle of the fairway for this. You know, a company that was able to raise a couple times in safe notes, the second time at a pretty material valuation, certainly relative to where the company was, and the CEO never had to give up any avenue of governance, not the slightest bit. So, and he didn't handle that situation. For some CEOs, you know, it wouldn't matter that much, you know, because they're going to be driven to do, quote unquote, what is right for their investors. They don't need a governance to, you know, to bang them on the head to do that. But in this case, you know, in part because it's an early stage CEO, and partially because they weren't using what I would call good judgment in this regard, you know, looked at it from the lens of, hey, I can make any decision I want whenever I want. You know, I'll give you information when I want to give you information. I won't feel like I did anything inappropriate if I make a decision and tell you afterwards, even if it was it seemed to be a strange decision. But now that same CEO needs something from the investors, because that, you know, now something he wants to happen cannot happen without relooking at the safe note or getting approval from some key investors, including me. And part of the response is, time to put in some governance. What's the big deal? It's just a small change. Why don't you just say it's no big deal? It's like, well, in the context of past behavior, you know, you need to, you know, be reminded that, you know, the investors do have kind of some levers here, and they have no reason to pull those levers if you're doing a good job. Even if the business is struggling, but you're doing an appropriate job, that's different. But if you're not, you know, the investors do need the counter leverage. So tell me this. So I was talking to some friends, and what they were telling me is that what makes a great CEO is someone who communicates well, who has a vision, who's very friendly, charismatic, really brings people along in the right type of way. You know, is that true?
Is that you? No, I'm just joking.
Really too well. You've been behind the scenes.
So that's another.
It's not me when I'm not running. It is me when I'm not running
anything. That's another, you know, set of papers I've written. So I've written like 3 or 4 papers in that area. So it's about, you know, CEOs and top executives. And this came from, I was able to get a data set from a firm called GH Smart that assesses C-level.
Denver-based firm, right? Denver-based firm. GH Smart, I think, is in.
I think Jeff is in Denver. The company is sort of all over the place, but I think Jeff's in Denver. And he's terrific. So GH Smart is actually a person. It's Jeff Smart. So they have data on CEO assessment. So they basically, when a private equity firm or public company or whoever is trying to hire a CEO, they will hire GH Smart and say, will you assess our top candidates? So it may be just one person, maybe 3, whatever, but they will then do a very, 4-hour interview of that candidate and try to understand, what he or she has done over their career, and then write up, a 40-page document about that person. And then they rate the person on 30 or 40 different criteria. And so we got these assessments, and over the years, we now, in our latest paper, I think we have almost 6,000 assessments. So it's so there are a lot of these assessments, and what you can do with it is say, okay, here, let's say out of the 6,000, 1,000 or 1,500 are CEO candidates. Then we've got the CFOs. Then we've got, other, candidates. And you can look at those. You can look at how they're rated on these 30 criteria. and then figure out, okay, what do CEOs look like? So if you look at CEO candidates relative to sort of a CFO, the CEOs will actually look different. So let's talk about candidates. I'm going to talk about who's hired, and then I'm going to talk about who's successful. So there are three pieces. The candidates look more talented. So if you kind of just add up all the ratings on these 30 criteria, and the criteria are, things like, do they treat people with respect? Do they have integrity? Do they get things done? Are they strategic? Do they hire well? So there's, everything you would think of that including the things you mentioned, are all there. So if you add up all the scores on these things, the CEOs are higher, the candidates. Then you can do a statistical, process where you figure out which of these variables go together. It's called factor analysis. You can call this, I don't know if it's big data, but it's certainly analytics. And it turns out that the second factor, this first factor is talent, which is just basically adding everything up. The second factor looks like a sort of combination of being efficient or executing versus being agreeable or a team player. And what that factor means is people tend to, the scores on that factor explain a lot of variance in the data. So some people will tend to be execution, some people will tend to be more on the agreeable team player. And it explains a lot of, you can take the 30 variables, compress it into these 4 factors, and explain half of the variation. So basically,
at this point, this is just who's a candidate.
It's who's a candidate, and it's seeing what's in the data, and it's a way of taking 30 variables, which are hard to play with, and compressing it into 4 that give you half the information. So you got half the information with 4 variables, so you don't have to use 30.
And what you're seeing is, with those 4 variables, you're seeing a separation.
Seeing very big separation. So
and the CFO candidates.
So I always ask people, for the CEOs, do you think they're more agreeable team players, which was one of the things you said, or are they more execution oriented, which is another thing you said? So what's interesting is that those variables are sort of tied together, and some people are strong here, some people are strong here, and they tend to be they kind of go together, and people are different. They explain a fair amount of variation. And when I ask that, people are kind of mixed. Some people think the CEO candidates look like the agreeable team people. Some people think the execution. It turns out very strong on execution, that the CFOs are actually more the agreeable, and the CEO candidates are more execution. The third factor looks like something.
Let me pause you there, because I think it's important. Execution sounds like a positive word, but then again, agreeable sounds like a positive word too. So what's the negative aspects that you might think of when you think execution, and what are the negative aspects when you think about kind of team building? Like, why aren't those both all positive?
Well, for the time being, I'm not making any judgment. I'm just saying they explain a lot of variation. But look, you can be an execution person and be a jerk, right? You can be agreeable and not get anything done. Yeah. So I would say you can be agreeable and get things done. You can be execution and be agreeable. You'd be in the middle there. If you did both, you were in the middle. Some people are more on the agreeable side. Some people more on the execution side. But we don't know yet which is better, right? Could be these people are better, these people are better, these people are better. All I'm telling you is CEOs tend to be more execution than the agreeable. Sorry about that. You're just that.
I think the important part of what you just said there, one of the important parts is without making any judgment, what you are pointing out is, let's make sure when we use this word that sounds like an all positive, execution, or this word that sounds like an all positive, which is team building, there are aspects of that word that you might not associate with being a positive trait. If you're all execution, you tend to leave people behind at times. If you're all execution, you tend to be, at times, people say that person's stubborn. If you're team building, the time you're saying is they're not decisive. You're saying they're all
Correct.
team building. How's consensus leading to fast action? So there's two sides to the coin when you have just those two, as an example. But that's true with each of your other examples too. It's there's positive in the word. Let's make sure we understand the full meaning of the word.
Correct. And so I haven't told you anything other than the CEOs tend to be more execution.
The candidates at this point, because right now you've just told us the candidates for CEO, the
right,
CFO. So the next layer of story is who gets hired, right?
Now I'm going to come to that. Now the third factor is something that looks like charisma. So the CEOs are more charismatic, which is persuasive, proactive, enthusiastic, and the CFOs are more kind of managerial. And then the fourth factor is something that looks like creative, strategic versus analytical is the wrong word, but again, more whatever the opposite of creative, strategic.
Would tactical be a good opposite word?
Tactical, or again, managerial or operational. And so the CEOs are more talented. They're more execution oriented. They're more charismatic, and they're more creative, strategic. The candidates. So and the CFOs are like the opposite. It's very interesting. Then if you look at who gets hired, those results remain, but the people who get hired tend to be, you go from really strong on execution to positive on execution, but less positive. So within the pool, they're moving toward the more, people who are more in between, right? So it's agreeable, the people who execute still, but they're a little more agreeable. And that's actually true, I think, in all the positions, they move toward more agreeable. So you tend to get
even in the charisma?
And on the agreeable, the charisma moves a little bit. You hire a little bit more charismatic. So of the candidates, creative, strategic doesn't move.
Right from the middle is what you're saying. Of the four categories, sounds like 3 to 4 move toward the middle, but one of the 4, charisma, moves maybe a little bit the opposite.
Charisma moves toward more. Actually, talent moves toward more. So they take more talent, they take more charisma, they take less execution, and then strategy doesn't move.
Okay, gotcha.
So that's the
gets hired.
That's who gets hired. And then we looked at who succeeded, and I've got one thing I did with was I did this with the GH Smart data with a subset of it, and the people who succeeded, and I asked people, is it the agreeable, team people or the execution? And again, people are 50-50. It turns out that one's very strong. It is execution. So
how do you know if a CEO is successful? Is it just, who looked the part the best, who?
So I've got two. The first time we did it, we did it with, it was more private equity and venture capital funded companies.
Yep.
So you could see, did the venture capitalist or private equity investor, what did they say about the CEO? So there you're getting it, straight from, essentially a board member investor. And if we couldn't get an answer from them, we would then go and look, did how'd the company do? So did the CEO stay and the company had a big exit? That was good. Was the CEO fired? That was bad. And then, or did they sell the company? It was clearly a bad investment. That was bad. And then, there were some things that were in between, but you could get a good sense. This was clearly successful. This was clearly not, and stuff was in between.
And,
And
and the criteria was financial outcome, right? It was return on
this is financial. This is financial outcome, and largely, although sometimes there were a couple of cases the private equity investor or venture capitalist said this was a good CEO, but we had a bad outcome. So there were a couple of that, but it's very correlated with financial. And what turned out to be very strong in the data is talent. More talented people did better. The execution oriented people did better. Agreeable team player, the team variables weren't negative, but they were kind of irrelevant. What was relevant was execution. And so that's sort of the strong, and charisma didn't do very much, actually. The creative strategic did. So the variables that matter were creative strategic, execution, and general talent. And with the execution being the strongest. And so the takeaway from that is, don't necessarily want to hire a jerk, but don't hire the person who's a team player, agreeable, who doesn't get things done. And that you absolutely have to have somebody who executes, or you are at risk.
And when you think of, this isn't in your data, presumably, but when you just come to mind, who are the most successful kind of CEOs of the last, 5-10 years? You start rattling off names of people. So I won't say the names. A lot of names are obvious, but if you could say some of the names that come to mind.
I'll say some of the names. So take Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, right? Or Steve Jobs, right? These are not agreeable people.
Really?
Or I shouldn't say they're not disagreeable, but they are tough, right?
Yeah.
So they are like super execution and have done very well. Then you've got someone like Satya Nadella, who's actually very agreeable, but boy, does he execute. And if you read his autobiography, he is his key things when he says, what does he do? It's like clarity, getting things done. He is all about execution, but he does it with a very pleasant wrapper around it. By the way, he was a student of mine. He took entrepreneurial finance and private equity from me in 96 or 97. So that's
a big deal out of your former students. That's just tell me all.
No, I've got you. I've got Satya. I've got Kevin at Apple. I have another good Brian Nickel, who just took over Starbucks, was a student. So it's very cool.
You've probably had more influence in shaping the trajectory of your students than maybe you even realize. I mean, it's your way of helping us think and problem solve and whatever skills we brought to the table independent of that. I think you really certainly helped me, and I suspect the others kind of pull those together and make it much more powerful. And I was going, one other thing that you and I have had this conversation, I think is really interesting throughout this study, is the decisiveness. And I'm going to say this in words, and you tell me if this is the way you were conveying it. So the real good leaders make decisions quite often with insufficient data. But the difference is when you talk about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs, they're not stubborn about the decisions they made. When they get more data, they don't really waste a lot of time fretting over, oh my gosh, I'm going to look like I was stupid before, and I'm changing direction, and people are like, why do you keep changing your mind? They just move on to the next thing. Okay, I know I tried something. I now know more information. I see what was maybe working, what wasn't. Now we're going to turn our direction this way, and they just do that without really putting a lot of weight into, oh my gosh, the whole organization is going to be this or be that. It's like, we got to get on the right path. It's not that one. Maybe it's this one. Is that the right way to think about that?
I think that's absolutely true. Again, it's not. I can't say that from my data. I can just say people who make decisions and get things done. That's what you want. But I think that's very consistent. And I think the reason there's a little bit of a conflict between the agreeable team player is that when you make decisions, right, you're gonna usually make some people unhappy, right? So you're not everyone's going to agree. And so I think the people who don't make decisions, who kind of, if you want to be liked too much,
Yeah.
you don't make decisions. If you're you or Jeff Bezos or Musk or I think Satya, you make a decision, see what works. If it works, you keep doing it. If you don't, you do something else. And actually, Ulysses S. Grant actually said something about that in there's a great quote it was in the biography. There's a recent biography of him that was excellent. He basically said, in war, the worst thing is not to decide. He goes, if we decide and we've done the wrong thing, we can quickly do the other thing. But if we don't decide, that can ruin everything. And it's why he won the Civil War. He was the only one who would fight, and he didn't always do the right thing, but he would adjust if he had.
Yeah, very, very cool. So what have we not talked about that you'd like us to spend a little time on?
I mean, you've talked about what I did with Polsky and the New Venture Challenge, and I think that the research is we talked about venture, we talked about buyout, we talked about the CEO and executive talent thing. So that's you've done very well.
Yeah. Let me ask this. This may be a good way to end it. What do you love most about finance? So go back to your roots, pure finance. Like, what got you enamored with it to begin with, and what really excites you about what we mean by the word finance?
So that's a very good question. I would say a few things. First of all, what I mentioned earlier, it's very exciting to see value created. I mean, and to figure out how do you create value in society, and I think the best measure of that is economic value. Why? Because you don't create economic value comes generally from generating profits or cash flow over time. And to generate economic value, you've got to be making customers happy and doing it at a lower cost than you're providing them. So I find that actually, very exciting. In the early stage, the venture investments are really interesting because that's the future. And then on the buyout or just general corporate side, you're making companies better. So that'd be one thing. Second of all, it's I'm an analytical person. I've always been like the analytics and math and finance. You clearly have to you have structure, you have analytics, you can use statistics and economics. So it's sort of you've got this nice combination where on the qualitatively it's really interesting. You're doing something that I think is clearly like you have to do this to have an operating economy or a successful economy. I think the world maybe underappreciates that these days. So I think that's how you can afford to do all the things that you can do in this country. It's because you create economic value. And then on the analytical side, it's fascinating. You can apply analytics, you can think about it, and that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, that's what I love about the studies that you do, is that you're so committed to how do I get my hand on the right sets of data? How do we let the data guide us to what the story really is, as opposed to wedding yourself to a hypothesis and the data magically seems consistent with it. And then one thing I want to go just touch on, you mentioned when it comes to creating economic value, that you can't do that without customers being pleased with your service. But you also can't do it if you don't have a team and employees kind of team broadly defined who, are passionate about what they're doing, who are enjoying what they're doing, who are committed to delivering great service for customers, but are also, as a culture, in my opinion, also understand the linkage between employees that have a more secure, fruitful work environment over a longer term, not just if customers are happy, but also if you're delivering value to investors. If you got a really pleasant work environment that's not doing anything for investors, well, you better enjoy it while it lasts, because it's going to end pretty quick, or things are going to be taken away from you real quick. And likewise, if you're delivering value for investors and delivering service for customers, but in a way that is on the backs of kind of employees who don't feel good about what they're doing, you're not going to deliver much more value for very long, and you're not going to have happy customers for much longer. So those three things have to feed off each other. It's not which two do you favor. It's all three. So anyways, this is great. And I so appreciate kind of not just what you did when I was your student, because then we kind of lost touch. I went my way and busy and all this stuff, but we got reconnected, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And your importance in my journey over the last 15 years, including how to give back in ways that spur and inspire others to develop businesses, that's also been very valuable to me. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And as I said, it is a great pleasure to see how well you've done, and to have had some part of it. I at least didn't mess it up, and to have been able to get back together and do things with you. And I look forward to continuing to do things on the entrepreneurship side.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you.
Great.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars featuring Steve Kaplan. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Allie Berman, Emily Notaro, and Gibson Siegert.